Hello, global gardeners, and welcome to another edition of your Gardening Week on a Monday where we talk gardening, answer questions about gardening, share gardening stories, and move forward with our Gardening Week with more information. And that's why I'm here today. Good to see you all. We have people checking in from all over. Pat is back from Trinidad, Colorado. We've got Bettina from Ontario, Canada. We also have Jay and Heidi, our wonderful moderators, also from the US and Canada. Let's go ahead and start with a question from Lisa, wondering, should I have my daughter pull all my tomatoes and such, or cover them with tonight's low at 50, which is 10 degrees Celsius? And that's a great question because that's exactly some of the things we'll be talking about today as we make the shift from summer to autumn in the Northern Hemisphere. And for those of you in the Southern Hemisphere, congratulations, you're about to start your spring. So 50 degrees, you've probably heard me say this before, is one of those magic numbers in gardening to try to remember. And when we get to that as a low temperature in the spring, that's when I start planting things like tomatoes and peppers. But when we get to that temperature in late summer or autumn because of cooling conditions, that's when I start thinking about covering the plants, protecting the plants, or even pulling the plants, which we've talked about in recent weeks. It's not that bad of a number. So direct answer to your question, Lisa, no, I don't think you need to pull or cover when it's 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius. When it drops below that, now you need to have more concern. So for instance, my garden this week is going to be just a few degrees above freezing. Tonight and tomorrow, our temperatures are supposed to drop down to about 37 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 3 degrees Celsius. I will be covering my plants and I will be pulling some of the ones that are no longer performing, because when temperatures start getting closer to freezing, those summertime plants, those tomatoes and peppers and squashes and pumpkins, they're just not going to be producing. They're not going to be setting flowers. The fruit's not going to be growing. And it's time to start thinking about the end of the season for those plants. So, Lisa, you still have a little bit of time. My temperatures have been at 50 or below for a few weeks now, and I have not been covering my plants. And I'm still harvesting a lot of those summer crops. They're just starting to slow down. It's when you get closer to freezing, within about 10 degrees Fahrenheit of freezing, or about 5 degrees Celsius away from freezing, that's when I really start targeting the protective measures that I need to take for my plants. So take a breath, relax a little bit. You've got a little bit of time for planning, and those are some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. PD is saying good morning to all of us. PD, back to you for a wonderful hello on a Monday in Virginia. Harvesting pounds of tomatoes and peppers every couple days. It's incredible. That's awesome. That's one of the wonderful things about this time of year for those of us that finally have those crops coming in, particularly tomatoes. I've been eating tomatoes. They're coming out my ears. I actually love it. Greg says, hi all, back to you, Greg. Too many people schedule meetings during the Gardener's Guide Live. What are they thinking? I agree. What are they thinking? You should tell them to come join us. They'll probably get more out of it than a Monday morning meeting that most people probably don't want to get to. Bobby Wilson, hello to you. Linda Davidson. David Gingras is checking in from Moncton, New Brunswick in Canada. It's awesome that you're here today, and always nice to see Frank from Pueblo. So a lot of good old regulars, and I don't mean old from an age perspective, but a time perspective, that you're all here today. Linda's wondering, can you discuss asparagus bed care at the end of the season, please? Sure. And I'm actually at that point right now. And so if you're growing asparagus, you should have allowed the spears to grow through the summer. And they grow into that nice fern-like plant And at this time of year, for those of us that have the asparagus starting to fade as we go into autumn, you have to think about, what am I going to do with that fern? And so when it starts to brown, when it starts to die off, which is probably going to happen pretty soon, you can go ahead and cut them down. Cut them down all the way to the ground. You leave asparagus growing in the summer so that it can produce all that wonderful energy from the sun back into the roots, and that's what's going to generate the new spears next year. But once the plant has faded, there's no reason to keep it in place. So go ahead and cut it down. And then for the soil, at the end of the season, I'll do a couple things. And it varies depending on what I have available. So I'll usually spread some compost on the surface. This year I have some dried chicken manure, so I'll be spreading some chicken manure on the surface. And then I'll be refreshing the mulch, the organic mulch, going into winter. And so over the course of the winter, I've got new compost, chicken manure, dried leaves, grass clippings on the soil to help protect the soil, and they'll gradually decompose. Now, in my region with my cold winters, decomposition ceases when the ground freezes. But in spring, as everything starts warming up again, now all that organic matter is right there, ready to revitalize all of those soil microorganisms in the spring. And then the spears will just shoot right up through all that organic matter and all of that mulch. And then during the course of the growing season, there's very little, if anything, I do with my asparagus to keep it growing. So the bulk of it is happening now to help refresh the bed. I don't get in and dig up. Those, you really don't want to disturb the roots. So it's not amending and working soil or working that organic matter into the soil. It's just placing it all on top and then refreshing the mulch. And that's all there is to it. I actually don't spend much time on my asparagus beds other than just that little bit in the fall. And the asparagus actually does pretty good. So hopefully that'll help you, give you a few chores maybe you can take for this next week and then move forward. Gregory's wondering, could I trick my summer crops by bringing them inside, heating pad and grow lights? Sure, yeah. There's one of those things, we actually haven't talked much about it, about the light aspect and the temperature aspect for many plants that we're growing in our garden. The cells within the plants, there are photoreceptive cells that actually are looking at the sunlight, so to speak. They don't actually have an ocular nerve or anything like that, but they can detect when the days are getting shorter. And so many of the plants we're growing will change how they grow and whether they put flowers on, whether they produce fruit, based on the amount of light they get. We've talked about onions in the past as a plant that is very dependent on the length of sunlight as to whether you're growing a short day onion or a long day onion. Most plants follow some type of calendar internally within their cells, and a lot of it is based on light. More so light than heat, but there are some plants that will definitely respond to the heat. Now, depending on where you live, it may be too late, because to really fool the plants, you want to catch before you have a dramatic drop off. And so the longest day of the year was in June, and that's 3 months past. So we've already had decreasing sunlight for 3 months, and the plants know that. But you might be able to extend your season a little bit and fool them into thinking that it's a constant September, and the way the plant grows in September can be extended into October and November by bringing them inside and giving them that light and that heat. So yes, that is definitely possible. For the best effects, think about this next year and bring your plants in, depending on the plant, in August, and you can really dramatically improve your season, especially peppers. Peppers are a real good one that you can bring inside in mid-summer, for instance. And if you give them the light, you can grow peppers indoors all winter long if you fool them into thinking they're in a perpetual summer. So yeah, definitely something to try and experiment with. Llama, good to see you back. 38 this morning. and that's a little bit more. It's about 3.5 Celsius, going to be 90 in a few days, which is 32 Celsius. And that's kind of the mode I'm in right now. We're not quite getting that hot this week, but close to it. So we're going to have some big dips and some big highs. And Carla shared on our Facebook Gardener Scott community group page her forecast, and it's a roller coaster like that. Many of us in the Rocky Mountain region of the United States are seeing that right now with lows and highs and lows and highs, extreme variations. And that's one of the things I wanted to talk about as well today, where as we move into autumn, if you're lucky, you have a nice gradual decline where the days start getting shorter, they start getting cooler. You can anticipate that within your garden, and then you put your garden to bed for the winter, assuming that you have a cold winter. But for many of us, it's the ups and the downs, the colds and the hots. And one of the things I wanted to talk about today is covering the crops on those cold days, as I mentioned briefly just a few minutes ago. That's what I'm going to be doing today, because the cold weather is coming for tonight and tomorrow night. But then it's warming back up again. I only need to cover my plants for a couple nights, and then I can take those covers off. And so this is a time of year that for many of us, it's actually a very busy time of year if we want to keep our garden going, because we need to protect the plants. And when I say protect the plants, I'm generally speaking about a hoop system of some type covered by a plastic or a cover of some type. Often a sheet, an old bed sheet, is enough to cover the plants and add that extra little protection if temperatures are dropping down below that 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Plastic can be more effective. If you put the plastic on late in the day, the sun will go through the plastic, warm up the soil, and you create kind of a little mini greenhouse. That's a great way to protect your plants through the evening. But then during the day, when it gets as warm as we've just been talking about, you have to take those covers off, because now the plants will overheat if you don't remove it. And so planning and having the hoop in place is a great start. And then having that plastic or that tarp or that sheet or whatever you're using in place. And with a little bit of practice, you should be able to look at the forecast, see if it is a consideration, go out, cover the plants, protect them through the night, and then the next morning, go out, remove the cover, or at least open up the cover to allow some of that hot air to escape, and you repeat as necessary. It may only be a couple days, it may be a couple weeks as you get closer to winter and sustained temperatures. But now's probably definitely the time to start thinking about it. Hello, Laura in Arvada. Always nice to have you here. DJ is in Aurora, Colorado. Nice to see so many Colorado people here today. It was so nice. I had a really good week in my gardening world. We started up our gardening club again because of all of the problems of the last year and a half. We haven't met in all that time. So my garden club just met this Saturday for the first time, and it's so nice to get back and speak with all those local gardeners who are having the same issues I am, the same successes I am, and just share our stories. And I've said this many, many times, that you should expand your gardening world and try to find those gardeners in your area. Well, look for a gardening club in your area, and that can be a great way to start. So it was so nice to see some of my fellow Colorado gardeners in person at a gardening club, but it's also nice to see all of the other Colorado gardeners here as well, including Rob's Allotment channel from the UK. Always nice to have the UK represented. And so it truly is a global audience. Isn't this great? I just love Mondays getting together and talking gardening around the world. Okay, Isabel, thank you so much for that super chat contribution. I always appreciate that, and thank you. Is it possible that my neighbor's cats, 12 of them, ate my Brussels sprouts? Oh, absolutely. Cats and dogs eat plants. They will will often be like deer, where they just nibble and browse throughout the garden. If they find something that they like, they will definitely chew it to the ground. If you've ever grown catnip, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So there are a number of grasses you can grow, cat grasses. If you do suspect that your cats are eating, or your neighbor's cats are eating your garden, next year put in some of those cat grasses that they tend to like, and hopefully they'll stay away from the rest of your garden, because like most pests, if you give them a crop to eat that they like, they'll tend to stay away from the crops that you don't want them to eat. So yes, very possible. I don't know. I've never had a cat that ate a Brussels sprout, but I've had a lot of people share stories with cats eating different things. And Mala right now is eating a lot of stuff. I was doing some weeding this week in the garden. As soon as I'd pull out a weed and put it on the ground, she'd grab and run with it. And she'd chew on it, and occasionally would swallow some of whatever the weed happened to be. Dogs and cats do that. So yes, very possible that could be happening. Anticipate in the future, and you might be able to prevent the problem. I would say go out and actually see if you still have some Brussels sprouts left. One of the easiest things to do is just take some flour and sprinkle flour on the ground, and then come back the next day and see if there are any paw prints left behind that you can identify. A little bit of detective work to see if there is a particular pest. And you may find out that it's a squirrel or a rabbit or some insect pest. You never know. But hope you can track that down. That is one of those nice things to try to figure out. Sheena's Keto Prepared Homestead is here today. Always nice to see you. Isabella Israfil from New York. Nice to have you here as well. Karen's wondering, what is the best way to transplant asparagus? So if you buy asparagus, most of the time, if not all of the time, it's going to be a bare root plant. It's going to be a plant in its dormant stage that has been dug up, usually during the winter, by the nursery, and then shipped out in early spring while it's still dormant, and then you plant it in early spring. You water it, the soil warms up, and the plant grows. That's also the best time to transplant using the same method. Wait until late winter, early spring, whenever you can work the soil. Try to dig up those plants while they're still dormant, and then move them to a new area. Water, take care of, ground warms up, they grow, and you have transplanted your asparagus. That's the best time. Now you can, like any plant, dig it up at any time of year and move it and transplant it. The key is that there's a best time, like for asparagus, while it's dormant. So if you're not able to do it in the spring, I tend to think that doing it while the plants are still small is better than when the plants are large. So like now, where I've got full-size spears with the ferns growing, the ferny leaves growing, now would not be a good time to really transplant that, because the leafy energy is going back into the roots, and I'm disrupting that if I attempt to transplant right now. But early in the year, if the plant is just starting to grow and those spears are just starting to emerge, that would be the second best time to transplant, because the soil is probably easier to work. But try to do it when it's dormant, and I think that's where you'll see the best or better results if you do that. Okay, let's see what else we have. Brian's wondering, how do I treat Everbearing Raspberries in the fall when finished harvesting? And so typically, if you're talking about an ever-bearing raspberry, you're talking about a raspberry that is fruiting on the second year's growth. So you have the primocanes and the floricanes that grow at different years. One in the first year, one in the second year. and you'll get most of the fruiting in that second year. I have a summer bearing raspberry that doesn't give me an early crop. It just gives me a late crop. And so the key difference is that the raspberries I'm growing, the heritage, are a type of raspberry that fruits on that first year cane. The Everbearing raspberries tend to fruit early in the year, and then during the summer, and then late in summer on that second year cane. That's why they're called Everbearing Raspberries, because you're getting more of a crop during that second year. The key with pruning and going into fall with raspberries is understanding exactly which type of raspberry you have. So my summer bearing raspberry that fruits on the first year canes, I can chop it all the way down to the ground, and then it grows next year and I get a late crop. In fact, I enjoyed my first raspberry yesterday. I was out watering and my first red raspberry, it's so delicious. Mine are getting ready to harvest right now. But for the Everbearing, or for that raspberry that you know is a type that is fruiting on the second year, you can't cut all of the canes down. You have to make sure you're only cutting down those second year canes, the ones that are fruiting right now. You have to leave the canes that just sprouted this year because they're going to fruit next year. And so that's one reason why I like growing the summer bearing, because they're easy. You just chop them all down and they come back. But for the other types of raspberries, you're going to have to actually get in there and look, and wherever you've been harvesting, prune down those canes. And if there's a cane that hasn't flowered yet, leave it in place so that next year you can get that fruit. So there you have it. And it's a little more difficult. In my region, I have an insect called a raspberry cane borer, and it actually will bore into the canes of that type. That's why I grow a summer bearing, so I can chop everything down, because I have tried growing those Everbearing in the past, and I had the cane borers that overwinter in the cane, and then the larvae eat the plant from the inside out, and you lose your whole crop. So I hope you don't have that issue. But you got to get in there, determine the difference between the canes, and only prune down the ones that have already given you a harvest. Okay, let's see. Dwayne is wondering, what is the best material to cover plants during a frost? Does breathability matter in Alberta, Canada, Rocky Mountain Province, where temperatures fluctuate? Great question, Dwayne. And so the key when you're talking about protection or increasing the temperature around the plants, breathability does matter, which means you don't want breathability. You want to hold that warm air around the plant, especially in Canada, northern United States, Rocky Mountains, where it gets very cold at night. If the material that you're covering your plants with is breathable, then all of that warm air around the plant is going to seep out into that cold air and be replaced by that cold air, and you've lost the protection. The protection really only exists for a couple hours before the air around the plant is the same temperature as the air outside the cover. The purpose of covering the plants in cold weather is to hold that heat in. The soil will radiate the heat that it has absorbed during the day. Normally, in uncovered areas of our garden, that heat radiates out into the air and the soil cools down to be reheated the next day by the sun. If you cover with an impermeable material like plastic, then as that air leaves, that warm air leaves the soil and attempts to leave the bed, it's now held in place by the plastic. And that's why it can become so effective, because you can get an extra 3 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit protection around your plants by just covering them with plastic, because that heat from the earth can't escape. And then the next day that heat is replenished and you can help your plants make it through the night. If you put in a heating source like Christmas lights, the old-fashioned Christmas lights that get hot, you could put those underneath your hoops and plastic to generate heat, and you get even better protection because that plastic is holding in that heat around the plant. I've mentioned this before, and you can find this online, Colorado State University and the extension website. They have some information of tests that one of the horticulturists ran years ago. And they were able to continue growing in a garden bed that was covered with hoops, that had Christmas lights. And then they put one of those mylar space blankets over the bed and plastic. They were able to get down to 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's minus 18 Celsius. And they were able to keep the temperature inside that hoop well above freezing and grow those plants because they had that covering that didn't allow any heat to escape. Well, not much heat escape. And they had a heat source. So yes, the material matters, and the best material would be something like plastic. If you really want to generate the extra heat, add a mylar reflective blanket to it, something along those lines. And that's kind of how you want to approach the fluctuation. But as I mentioned before, you need to make sure that you're in the process, you have a process where you're removing that during the day, because if you're having the hot days, then that heat just builds up and now can be too much for the plant. So it's a lot of work, but choose something that will hold the heat around your plants for best results. Okay, let's see. Julie is saying, I have some powdery mildew on pumpkin and butternut squash plants, but can still stick a fingernail in the squash skin, and the pumpkin stems are still green. Should I pick anyway? I wouldn't. The powdery mildew affects the plant. Those leaves are going to give greatly reduced, if any, energy, depending on how far advanced the powdery mildew is. But there should still be some photosynthesis happening in that plant. Even the green stems and stalks will give some photosynthesis. And so as long as your temperatures are staying warm enough and you're not dropping down as low as what I've been talking about, I just let the plants go. Powdery mildew won't affect the fruit. It can slow down the ripening depending on how many leaves are affected, but especially if the skin is soft, that means it's not ripe yet. And most of the squashes that we harvest are not going to really ripen after harvesting. You really want to try to get the ripening to happen on the plant. And so I would go ahead and wait as long as you can, and hopefully that situation will improve a little bit. You can pick, for instance, butternut squash. You can eat butternut squash before it's fully ripe. The key difference is the eating and the storing. So I'm growing butternut squash with the intent to store some of that butternut squash into the winter. It won't store well if the skin is still soft and if it hasn't fully ripened. And so if you want to harvest it to eat it right away, you can do that. You can always eat a young squash. But if you really are growing it to store, you want to leave it on the plant as long as possible so that skin hardens and that you can put it into storage for a long period of time. So little patience, give it a little bit more time, and see how it turns out. So let's see. Jay's saying that yesterday had my turnips and other garden vegetables in my first ever oxtail soup. Awesome. I've never made oxtail soup. I've eaten it in restaurants, but good for you, Jay. I think that actually sounds like a cool thing to try. I might have to try something like that. Hello to the Netherlands with Earthly Spaces. Nice to have you here on a Monday as part of our global audience. I think that's awesome. Great to have you here. Dwayne's wondering, can you grow smaller species of eggplant indoors? Sure. It gets back to what I was talking about earlier with the question about bringing plants indoors, and peppers, for instance, can grow very well indoors. As long as they have enough light and heat. Eggplants fall into that same category. As long as you give them enough light or heat, they should do fine. The Black Diamond eggplant that I grew this year as part of the single seed challenge, and they've been doing wonderfully. They're only about 12 to 15 inches tall, so a relatively compact plant. And I could easily grow that indoors in a pot underneath lights with some heat to keep the air nice and warm around it. So yeah, absolutely. If you've grown eggplant indoors, go ahead and share the variety with Dwayne. But I would say try Black Diamond. That's the one that I grew this year, and it's a pretty compact plant. And I definitely think that's something that you might be able to get away with as an experiment. And it's definitely something to continue trying. Okay, let's see. Kevin's checking in from the local ER. Okay, just getting tested. Hope it all goes well, Kevin. Always nice to have you here. Hope everything comes out the way you expected. Earthly Spaces is wondering, how come my eggplant in a pot with a diameter of 30 centimeters, that's close to a foot, grows good, gives flowers, but no fruit? Do you have any idea what's the problem? It could be a few things. It could be the pollination. It could be one of those things that if you have the pot set off and you're not getting the pollinators, the flies and the bees, that could have an impact. It could be the temperature. We've talked about this before, that if the temperature gets above about 32 degrees Celsius, the flowers will drop and you'll lose fruit production. And this is something that we often just aren't even aware of when we're growing in pots and containers. Often those pots are on a patio next to a wall close to our house, and while our normal air temperature might not be that hot, there might be reflective heat off that wall. And I've had that issue before, where I've tried growing things in pots and we're next to a wall, and the sun's energy reflecting off that wall onto that pot warmed up the pot to the point, or warmed up the plants to the point that they didn't do as well as if they had been in open ground in cooler air. So it could be the location where it's just a little microclimate and maybe it's getting a little bit too hot. It could be cold nights. We were talking about the temperatures changing right now, and I'm not sure how it is in the Netherlands, but if the nighttime temperatures are dropping below 10 degrees Celsius, you're going to have the same kind of issue where the flowers will set and then you're just not going to get the pollination. And then it could be just the location itself and the time of day. Assuming you do have the pollinators, if they're not coming until later in the day, the best pollination tends to happen early in the morning as the flowers open up and the insects come, and then the pollen will degrade over the course of the day. And so that could be an issue too. If you have few pollinators, maybe they're just coming too late in the day and they're not getting full pollination. So there's some possibilities. It's hard to tell for sure, but there's some reasons why you may not be getting the fruit, but you are getting the flowers. Michelle saying, I decided to forego a fall garden to really clean up and get control for spring. I'm tired of being behind the game and confused. It was a difficult choice, taking notes for next year. Excellent, excellent, excellent. I love that idea. And I've been doing a lot of the same. I really haven't done much of a fall garden this year. I've got a couple beds because I'm doing the same thing. I'm really focusing on my soil, on doing cover crops, on doing preparation for the spring, especially in some of the new beds that I just recently built. So I think that's a great idea. And that ties in with the theme of today as well. Depending on what your weather is, what kind of climate you have, you might be able to do some fall gardening and some winter gardening. But you have to ask yourself a question, and that's why I love this comment, Michelle. You have to ask yourself, how good is your soil? If your soil was amended in the spring and it's doing great, then you can move forward with a fall and winter garden and be fine because the nutrients will be there. I usually suggest before you add that extra crop, go ahead and put some extra compost down when you do the seeds or the transplants, just to add a little bit of a boost for the soil microorganisms. But if you didn't do a spring amending, you might want to forego the fall and winter garden and focus on your soil. Get your soil really boosted going into next year. And I've got a couple beds like that. That's one reason why I'm holding off. The bed I grew my garlic in didn't get amended in spring because the garlic was growing in that bed. And so that's one of those beds that has some plants growing in it right now that I'll be harvesting soon. And as soon as I harvest it, I'm going to be moving right into amending of that soil because it missed out on the normal spring boost, and it really needs some extra attention. So definitely take notes for next year, and yeah, being behind the plan and have that extra little confusion that gets thrown in. Sometimes it's just a really good idea to stop and slow down and get everything ready so that it's prepared for next year. So I really like that idea. Hope, faith, love, fabulous. I'm preparing my garden for fall and winter season. This year is my second time doing this, and I'm learning and want to learn more. So there you go. Hopefully a lot of the stuff we're talking about today will be real good for you. So let's talk a little bit more about the coverings, because the bed I was just talking about, where I have some lettuce growing, I've got some Brussels sprouts growing, I've got some kale growing, I've got some beets growing. Those are all plants that can handle cold weather. They can handle these dips in the nighttime temperatures that I have right now. Right now, they're actually covered with a shade cloth because my days have been so warm. I didn't want any of those plants bolting before I got to the harvest phase. And so now that those plants are covered by shade cloth, it also helps hold the temperature in. Now, it lets a lot of air out, but it also does cover the plants and give a little bit of protection. And so for now, with these days dropping closer to freezing, I'm lifting up the sides of the shade cloth during the day to let the sun in for these plants. And then I'm dropping the sides of the shade cloth to just help hold some of that heat in. I'm going to be replacing that shade cloth with plastic very shortly. I don't have to because those plants can handle the cool temperatures. But kind of the idea of tricking the plants. By boosting the temperature around the plants going into these colder nights, I'll basically give them a step up and they'll continue to grow, because all plants will slow down as the temperatures cool. But if we can delay that cooling, we can get more success in a longer season. So as you move into your fall and winter season, think about those coverings and how you're going to do it. Another thing, and I wanted to talk about this as part of the subject today too, is watering. As you move into these cooler nights and cooler days, you don't need as much water. And so this is a typical problem that could develop. I've had questions before from gardeners wondering why their plants are turning yellow in their fall garden or moving into the winter. Well, it may be, and it probably is, over watering. During the summer heat, the soil is going to evaporate faster. And so we need to water more often daily watering in the summer. But as we move into autumn, you don't need to water as much because you have less evaporation in those cooler conditions. So if you stay on your normal schedule of watering every single day, you could easily overwater your plants, drown them, and cause damage, if not death. So be sure to check your soil moisture if you're doing fall gardening, especially winter gardening when it gets much cooler. If you can grow into the winter, you may only need to water every 3 or 4 days, maybe even only once a week if you've got really good, rich soil with a lot of organic matter, because it's not going to be evaporating as quickly. So definitely adjust your water. Also, On these cool nights where you're going to cover your plants with plastic to hold the heat in, make sure you water beforehand, because moist soil will retain heat better than a dry soil. So if you're in the habit of watering in the morning after the soil has dried out over the course of the previous day and night, you might want to adjust your watering schedule. Start watering late in the day so the soil is nice and moist, starting to absorb some of that heat. Water is amazing for absorbing and holding that heat into the evening. So watering can be completely different in an autumn garden compared to a summer garden. And a lot of it, is developed with experience. You got to do it. You got to see how your schedule changes, how your plants react as part of it. But definitely think about the watering when you move into a new season like we are this week. And if you haven't looked at the calendar, the season changes this week. It's about time to have that new colder air for many of us, and the season where everything changes. Mage Grey Wolf, nice to have you back. I got around to harvesting my purple sweet potatoes. Great. They're so sweet on their own. My uncle thought they would be good for juicing. Interesting. You can juice anything. I don't know of anyone that juices potatoes. I say go for it. Do some potato juice and see how it turns out. And if it does, let us know how it goes. But it's nice that you had a good crop of the purple potatoes. That's awesome. Patrick, thank you so much for that contribution. Can I discuss overwintering strawberries? I definitely can, because I'm in the process of actually doing some experiments with that. And so I've been moving some of the strawberries from my strawberry beds into my green stock vertical grower system. And so I've got a couple videos about the green stock vertical garden. And if it's something that interests you, I always have a link in my description to the green stock, because you can get a discount if you use the Gardener Scott code. And so I'm putting strawberries in my new green stock leaf system this year with the intent of overwintering the strawberries. And so here are some concerns, because I did a few tests growing in pots last year. If you buy strawberries and plant them kind of like asparagus, most of the time you're going to get a bare root crown in spring that you put and water and grow, and now you have a strawberry plant. The strawberry plant is an extremely durable plant. It can handle harsh conditions, to include digging up and shipping while it's dormant and dry, and then replanting. So there isn't a lot that you generally have to do to overwinter. The key is that the crown, where all the leaves emerge from the roots, really is the only part of the plant that needs any type of protection. The big issue that I often see is people put too much protection, and then the crown ends up rotting. And here's what I mean by that. Mulching strawberries can help. Now, what I do is I just let my strawberry leaves turn brown and stay on the plant, and that is my winter protection. I let the dry leaves of the strawberry insulate the crown, because they're covering that crown. There's lots of air between those leaves, and it's a nice little insulation. And then when the snow falls in my garden, that adds extra insulation. So I really don't do much at all with my strawberries that are in my garden beds. In the spring, as the temperatures start to increase and it starts getting moister, the snow is melting, then I go out and just remove those leaves or spread them around the area as a mulch on top of the soil, so that crown doesn't get too wet. If it gets too wet, it can rot in spring. So an area with a really harsh winter, you might consider adding something like straw or dried leaves on top of your strawberries for extra insulation of those crowns. But you need to make sure you take off that mulch in the spring so that the air can get to that crown so it doesn't rot. That's the biggest issue when it comes to overwintering. Now, to the idea of growing in a pot or the green stock vertical garden. If the soil dries out, even though they ship the crowns bare root and dry, there's still some moisture in that root and crown. And that's why you can put it in the ground and water it and it grows. But if you allow your pot or the container that you're growing the strawberries in to dry out completely over the winter, then that root can desiccate. It can completely dry out and kill the plant. So you do need some winter watering. You do need to keep that soil moist during those days in autumn and spring where it might warm up. And that's typically what happens. In the areas with cold winters, the ground freezes, and then the day warms up. The soil warms up, the soil, that moisture in the soil evaporates. Then it freezes again, and that process continues until all the soil moisture is gone and the strawberry dies. So I had a big pot last year that I experimented with trying to overwinter strawberries in a pot without additional watering just to see if the snow would be enough. All the strawberry plants died. And so as I'm doing this test with the vertical garden, I'll be watering all winter long to make sure that the soil doesn't dry out, because container soil dries out much faster than in-ground soil. I'll occasionally go out and water the strawberries in my garden beds for the same reason, but usually with that mulch around the plant and with the snow in my area, that's enough. So there's a couple concerns to think about. Hopefully that answered your question, Pat. And especially here in Colorado in the mountains, the leaves of the strawberries and the snow is enough to protect the plant. And I'm in 5B zone, and I don't think I've ever lost a strawberry plant that was growing in the ground or in a garden bed. I've only lost the plants in the containers that I intentionally didn't water. In containers that I brought into a protected area and also helped keep the soil moist, the strawberries came back. So if you're growing in containers, that's a consideration. Put them in a protected area so that they don't have the real harsh exposure to the winter, and you might be able to keep the soil moist for a longer period of time. Yankee Sister, always nice to have you here. You bring a smile to my face every Monday. You probably noticed that. It just is always nice to see you here. Hello from 68 degrees New England. That is about 20 degrees Celsius. Canning, preserving, and growing fall seedlings inside. Enjoy life, everyone. Sounds like you're enjoying life, definitely. Haven't done any canning yet. I've already done some preserving of herbs and garlic and pickles and things like that. So we've talked about that in the past. This is a great time of year also as we move into autumn to do something with those crops that you're harvesting. If it's a nice winter squash like the butternut squash, you can store them in a nice cool location and they'll be fine for months to come. The same with all of your garlic. But for all those summer crops that might begin to fade if you don't eat them, figure out a way to preserve them so that you can preserve your successes moving into the months ahead. So thanks for sharing that, Yankee Sister. Always nice to have you here and to share your successes as well. Gary from Northern California says temperature checks at 8:30. It's 90 degrees in Sacramento. That's 34 degrees Celsius. A hot summer there. Absolutely. I feel your pain. Sorry to hear that. And your plants are probably trying to figure out what's going on, because also knowing that area, you're going to start having some cooler days ahead, I have no doubt. Buffalo 78 is wondering, I've lost about 6 inches of soil depth in my raised beds. Filling the loss with compost this fall. Will plants like asparagus be affected by the change in depth after adding so much soil? Yes and no. And so I have a bed like that. I mentioned it briefly in an earlier video this year. where I have all of those logs and those branches and that organic matter that I fill my lower raised beds with, and then put the soil on top and grow in them. Well, as all that organic matter decomposes, you're going to have settling of the soil. And yes, it does need to be replaced. For asparagus in particular, it's not that big of an issue. And so, like I said earlier when we were first starting off, that this time of year on my asparagus bed, I add more compost and more organic material and mulches to the top. That's to replenish a lot of that decomposition that's happening within the soil. Now, 6 inches is a lot. However, how deep is the asparagus? Asparagus roots can actually be pretty deep. And so in my beds, the asparagus roots run generally 8 to 12 inches deep. And then with some of that decomposition, most of that decomposition is happening above the root, because the plant, even though I did amend the soil when I put my asparagus roots in, the soil beneath the root really only was 3 or 4 inches deeper, maybe 6 inches deeper than the root with amended soil. Most of that amended soil is actually on top of the root because the root is buried so deep. So you might be fine if you put the asparagus in a bed or dug a trench and then placed the asparagus. Think about the soil beneath the roots. And if that soil is your native soil or just a typical garden soil, it probably is not decomposing a lot. It's probably all that organic matter in the soil above the root. Therefore, by adding compost above those roots, you'll be fine. You can, just to be sure, like we've been talking about asparagus already today, in the spring, go ahead and dig down and see how deep your roots are. See how well your plants grow into the spring, and you might want to raise the plants or transplant them depending on the depth. But asparagus roots can actually do well 15 inches deep. They'll still be able to grow up through the soil and produce strong plants. They'll do some adjustment on their own as the roots continue to grow. They'll actually move a little bit up and down in the soil as the plant gets bigger over time until they find that nice happy balance point that they like. But I wouldn't be too concerned about that. Now, there are other plants that you might have in your landscape where you have that much depth change of the soil that if you add 6 inches on top, now you're smothering the root. And so it depends on the plant, depends on the root, and it depends on the bed. So there are some biennial plants I'm growing, and like carrots, for instance, if I allow them, did this last year, if I allow them to go to seed, they stay in the ground over the winter, and then they'll flower the second year. That was one of those beds that I had about a 5-inch drop in the level of the bed. I just accepted that drop because I didn't want to smother the roots in that bed by adding a lot of organic material. But then when I harvested the roots after winter, I went ahead and dug everything up. Then I added all of the compost and organic matter for the rest of the season after those plants were out. So it depends on the plant, depends on how much you're replacing, and you might want to actually dig into the ground a little bit and see what you find. Okay, let's see what else we have. Hot Pepper Paul, is always nice to see you here. Show some love, smash the like button. Thanks for that, Paul. I appreciate it. Highlands Community Club says smashed. Thanks so much. I appreciate it. Okay. I do appreciate the love. It's one reason why I'm here every Monday. I love the love. I love giving the love. I love receiving the love. It's awesome. Hot Pepper Paul's wondering, how do you juice bacon? Good question. Bacon juice would be fine, but you can make jam out of a bacon. If you ever had bacon jam, that's definitely a way to enjoy a different side of bacon. I saw a video on bacon jam recently, and I thought, I got to do that. It looks so good. Lola Young's Gardens of Love, a new member to the Gardener Scott channel community. Welcome. So nice to have you here. If you don't know, if you're watching on a PC, you'll see the blue and white button underneath the videos. If you're watching on a phone or a tablet, you have to go to the Gardener Scott YouTube homepage, and you can see an option there. Beneath my videos in the description, you can see an option to join the community. It helps support the channel, helps keep me going, but it's also a great way to get some nice perks and share in the community. Share your photos on our Facebook page, ask questions. It's a wonderful community. We have so much fun. And like I said, Carla earlier shared a screenshot of her forecast and had lots of consoling because of the cold temperatures that are coming up in her area. So we have Cal 1699. Hi to you. Nice to have you. Garden Girl is in zone 6. And so one thing also I wanted to talk about as we move into the autumn, and I've talked about this before, I'll just cover it briefly. When we talk about zones and we talk about gardening seasons and we talk about our frost dates, they are completely different things. And so especially if you're a new gardener, you need to know whether you're in zone 5 or zone 6 or whatever it happens to be. But you really need to get to know your weather at your garden in the different seasons. And so my zone 5B means that my coldest winter temperatures are minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about minus 26 Celsius. And so that's great. I now know how cold it's going to get in the winter, but it doesn't tell me anything about when my frost is coming. And so I should just barely escape my first frost this week. It's normal for my area to have a first frost in about 2 weeks from now. So I'm expecting that. It has nothing to do with my zone. So get to know the differences between your frost dates and your zones. I've got some videos that go into depth on this. Now's the time of year to start thinking about it. If you don't know what your first frost date is, that can really help you out in deciding when you pick your tomatoes that are green and when you pull the plants and when you recharge your beds with amending. Those are all good to do activities that usually take place closer to your first frost date. So start figuring out what that plan is based on your frost date, and you won't be too behind the curve moving forward in the gardening season. So, okay, I'm catching up. I'm scrolling through a lot of the comments that we've had because I've been focusing on some other stuff. Yeah, Paul says he's had the bacon jam, and Llama Llama's had bacon jam. There you go. That's the recipe idea for this week. Every week we tend to talk something having to do with harvests and food. We're not harvesting our bacon, but bacon jam can definitely be something to grow into. Garden Girl's wondering, what kind of soil do zinnias grow best in? So like most flowers, most zinnias will do well in a rich, well-draining soil. However, in my experience, zinnias will do well just about anywhere. They're one of those kind of plants that I spread some seed on top of and underneath mulch around my fruit trees, just across the pathway from my pollinator garden that I've shown in recent videos, and the seed sprouted. I did nothing really than just spread some zinnia seeds around and under the mulch. The soil underneath is terrible soil. I've got the thick wood chip mulch in place to gradually help improve the soil, but I thought I'll spread some zinnia seeds and see how they do. They sprouted. They're doing great. They're blooming. They look lovely. The soil is terrible. So zinnias are very forgiving. In a rich soil that's well draining, you'll get big plants with a ton of flowers. If the soil's not as good, you'll still get good plants and you'll still get some good flowers. So my whole area, this region, is terrible soil, and most of the gardeners I know grow zinnias because they'll do pretty well. Celeste says, I've cleaned out the bean plants, added soil, and topped with composted wood chips. Should I? What's the rest of that? Let me scroll down and see if there's more to that question from Celeste. Here we go. Cleaned out the bean plants, added soil, topped with composted wood chip. Should I plant a cover crop mix from True Leaf as well? I would. That's what I've done in some of those beds I've talked about, where I'm focusing on cover crops and moving into the spring. I did exactly that. Cleaned out the plants, added some compost, worked it into the soil. I got one bed right now that I talked about in the video where I showed that True Leaf Market blend. That's a video I did just a few weeks ago. Those plants are coming up great. I've got some of the brassicas that are starting to sprout. Some of those pea plants, those winter peas are starting to sprout. Some of those cereal crops, those grasses are starting to sprout. The bed looks great. It's already filling in real well. And so now would be the time to do it. And yes, I would say go ahead and do that. You don't have to. This is one of those things where when we talk about our soil, just adding compost is great. It's better than doing nothing. It can give a big boost to your soil. Adding compost and mulch is better. It gives even a bigger boost to your soil, helps protect the soil, hold in the moisture, really encourage those soil microorganisms. Doing compost and a mulch and a cover crop is better still, because depending on what kind of cover crop you're growing, as I discussed in that video, you'll get benefits from those plants that you're growing. And so whether those plants are legumes that are putting nitrogen in the soil, or you're turning the plant matter back into the soil to add organic material in the spring, it's all good. So think of it as building a pizza. You can build a cheese pizza, that's fine. You can do a pepperoni pizza, that's probably better as far as adding variety to your diet. You can do that pizza with the pepperoni and the mushrooms and the olives and the sausage, and that's even better still. And so that's kind of how I approach the preparation of my garden beds in autumn, is just adding all of those extra things to make the soil even better. So yeah, check out that video. Check out that True Leaf Market blend of the cover crops. And I'd say go ahead and do all of it. Now, you don't have to necessarily do it in that order. You could do the cover crops and not do the compost. Or you could do the cover crops and the mulch and not the compost. Or you could do the compost and the cover crops, and especially if it's a spreading type of cover crop, you might not need the mulch. So don't feel like it's an either or kind of a thing, or a one or all kind of a thing. You can do whatever combination you have time to do, or that you have the seeds to do, or that you have the inclination to do. But it's definitely consideration. And I'm doing as much, almost all of that on the beds this year, trying to get as much as possible. Love Always Jasmine saying, snails keep eating my freshly planted crops. Any tips? So hopefully you're getting some tips from others on snails. The thing that I found to be most successful with snails is trapping. And I've mentioned this before, where you take newspaper and wet it and roll it up and put it by your plants, and the snails crawl into the newspaper, and then you throw all that away in the trash, and you've collected a half dozen or more snails inside that rolled up newspaper. Same with cardboard. You can put wet cardboard down, and the snails will tend to congregate underneath that wet cardboard. Then you just pull the cardboard up and grab the snails and toss them away as well. You can do some other corrective actions and try to diatomaceous earth may or may not work. I've seen mixed results with the copper. That's always one of those great things where you surround the plant with copper, but you'll find videos on YouTube of the snails crawling across the copper. You can put a barrier around the plants, like a toilet paper tube around the plant, so that the snail just can't get to it. Those will often work, but the trapping tends to work best from my experience. It's easy, and the results are usually pretty good. Michelle Darby, a new member joining up today. Thank you for for being a member of the Gardener Scott community, Michelle. Nice to see you here, and I appreciate becoming a member. That's nice. Okay, let's see what else we have. I'm scrolling down. I know I'm a little bit behind with some of the comments. Oh, happy birthday to Michelle Darby as well. That's nice. Happy birthday. This is nice that you're here and spending some of your birthday time with us. Okay, let's see. Elsa's saying, I watched the video and ordered my blend, and it should be here anytime now. Awesome. Now, do I do cover crops after my fall gardens are done? I would do it at the same time. And I'd planned a video. I actually didn't get to it like I had hoped. But if you've got fall crops growing right now, go ahead and put in your cover crop seed around your fall crops. It's going to take some time for the cover crop seed to germinate and begin growing. And you really don't have that big a concern about the plants stealing nutrients from each other, because your established fall crop roots should be deep enough that they're getting nutrients deeper in the soil. The cover crop plants seedlings that are just starting to grow have just very small, shallow roots, so they're not going to interfere with your plants. And then as you harvest your fall crops, the cover crops are already growing. Those seeds are already sprouting. And now you just cut down your fall crops, and the cover crop's all ready to go, already protecting the soil. As they get a little bit bigger, before you reach the fall harvest, potentially, now it becomes a living mulch. And so especially like clover is a great living mulch. Cuts down on weeds, helps retain soil moisture, protects the soil, and it can be growing all the way around your fall crops and not cause any problem whatsoever. It's actually helping the soil while it grows. So do both. Go ahead and start seeding your cover crops while your plants are growing. That's what I've done in my tomato beds, is I've already sown the seeds around my tomatoes and my peppers so that they can germinate and start growing, because I only know I have a couple more weeks with the tomatoes and the peppers before the weather changes, and I'll have given my cover crops that extra couple weeks to start growing before the weather changes too dramatically. So go for it. Go ahead and do it now. While I'm thinking about it, let me go ahead and talk about the background today. This comes from Andre Amoratico. It's a few months old, but I just think it's a beautiful garden space. I particularly wanted to point out the hoops, because this picture was taken a few months ago, the height of summer, all the plants doing great, but the hoops were still in place. That's a great idea. And this is what I do with many of my beds, where I'll put my cattle panel hoops in and leave them through the whole season. Early in the season, you can cover your hoops with a frost cover or a row cover material to help keep the temperature up a little bit, but also help keep some of those insects out that might want to eat the seedlings. You take off those covers during the summer so that the sun and the heat keeps your plants growing, like all of these beautiful brassicas and squashes. And then the hoops are already in place for all of what we've been talking about today. Preparing for those cooler conditions, you just throw your cover over your plants and they're nice and protected. And so I really like what Andre has done with the hoops, leaving them in place. You can see some really nice trellises. I love vertical gardening, and I've got some videos on vertical gardening. I do a lot of trellising. You can see how many plants can be packed into a space if you do trellises, if you do some vertical growing in your area. So thanks, Andre, for sharing this picture of your garden and showing how beautiful it looked in summer while everything was growing. Back here, looks like we have some bird feeders, which I always love to see. That might be a bird bath. And so it's awesome. And then I also like the mix of the beds. I love my wooden beds because I think they look great, but especially with a nice brick pathway. What a classic look for a traditional garden. So I love this picture. I'm glad I could share it. I'm glad Andre shared it with me, because I would be proud of it as well and want to show it off to all of you. And so that's what I'm doing today, is sharing that picture. Share your pictures with me that I can include in a backdrop. And I want to thank all of you who have. there are some pictures that some of you have sent that I haven't been able to use. Send me a full-size file at gardnerscott.com, and I'll be able to put it in the background. The problem is, if you embed a photo in an email, the size of that file, when I display it like this, it's so grainy, it ends up looking blurry, and I just really can't use it. So many of you have sent me photos that I just can't use because the file size isn't big enough to give a beautiful backdrop like you see, where you can see the individual veins of the leaves. That would be better. So send me a full-size photo. Give me permission, because I've also gotten photos from many of you, but if you don't specifically say that I can use it, I'm not going to. I don't want to infringe on sharing something that you don't want to share. I don't want to cause any copyright issues because it's your photo. So unless you give me permission to share it, I won't share it. So thanks to all of you who have tried sharing but either didn't give me permission or didn't give me a full file size. And if you've shared a picture with me in months past and I didn't show it, probably because of one of those reasons. So keep sending me your pictures with your permission, full files, and I'll keep throwing them up on the screen every week and talk about just how beautiful all of your gardens are, all the things that you have to be proud of that you're sharing with me and everybody else. So that's always nice to see what everybody else is doing. I love that brick. I'm going to be doing something similar to this in the center of my garden. I'll be building it out, and I'll be putting in some formal brick pathways. So I just love that look. I think that's wonderful. Isabel also chalked up the membership today. So appreciate you doing that, Isabel. That's always nice to see you here on Mondays as well. There's Elsa Santiago giving me a nice super sticker. Thank you so much. I appreciate that contribution. It's always nice to see the support, and I do appreciate it. Okay, scrolling down to see if there's anything else I missed. John is saying, I pulled my tomatoes last Thursday in anticipation of rain over the weekend, along with temps in the 60s, and the tomatoes are sitting in a plate by the kitchen window to ripen. Nice, awesome. That's one of those things that I'm hoping to do here soon. I'm going to show some ways that you can ripen your tomatoes as I end up pulling some of my plants and taking those tomatoes that haven't quite ripened soon. But that's definitely what you can do is pull the tomatoes. You don't have to put them by a window. The sun or the sunlight is really not the key factor in the tomato ripening. It's the ethylene gas. And so if you really want to give a boost to the ripening of your tomatoes, put a banana or an apple near the tomatoes, and that will actually hasten the ripening as well, because the ethylene gas coming off of the bananas and the apples will help the tomatoes ripen if you want it to happen a little bit faster. Otherwise, it tends to be a little bit slower. So good for you. That's always a nice way to... So here's Mala. Did you see her pop up? She's saying, hey, you've been in here for over an hour now. How come you're not playing with me? So we're almost done. There she is. So say hello to everybody. So those of you who haven't seen Mala, I introduced her in a recent video where I was talking about pets and dogs in the garden, and she's a sweet girl, but she can only handle about an hour of my time away from her before she tells me that it's time to play, throw the ball, and go outside and be in the garden. She loves just being out in the garden, so she's a good patroller to help keep some of the pests away. She actually did a great job this week. I have a neighbor who has a lot of trees just to the north of where I am, and we have a few deer in the neighborhood, and the deer tend to go to her yard and bed underneath the trees at night. She also has a garden that they'll often try to nibble on, and she'll usually look out in her yard, see the deer, scare away the deer, and then they'll usually jump the short fence into my garden, and then she'll call me and say, hey, you've got deer in your backyard, at which point I have to go out and try to scare away the deer from my yard. Mala, this week, I was looking out the window and she was acting kind of strange. She was kind of rushing at the fence and then running away from the fence. She's a kind of a sensitive dog and can get scared easily. And so I went out to see what was going on, and there were deer in my neighbor's yard. And they were watching Mala with great anticipation. And Mala was not barking, not being aggressive, just kind of unsure what was going on, but she was at the fence with the deer. So I called my neighbor to say, hey, you've got the deer in your backyard. She came out, she scared off the deer, and they went in the opposite direction, away from my garden. So Mala's already doing her protective duties to keep the deer away. And so that was a fantastic event in my gardening week, is I didn't have the deer issues that I have had in the past. So Mala's gone back downstairs because I think she knows that we're going to be done soon. But it's one of those things that it's nice to have a helper in the garden, especially when it comes to some of those issues. Lars saying, I put the banana along with tomatoes in a brown paper bag to hasten ripening. Yeah, absolutely. That brown paper bag will help hold in some of that ethylene gas, and it definitely helps the tomatoes ripen. So good suggestion. Appreciate that, Lar. Colorado Bird Nerd, thank you for that contribution, that super chat. Thank you. Learned so much again today between listening to Gardener Scott as well as reading everyone's help in the chat room. And thank you for pointing that out, Colorado Bird Nerd. Yeah, that's why Mondays are so great. I learn stuff when I go back over the comments and see some of what you all are saying back and forth to each other. I learn every week as well. I just can't be focused on everything that's being said so that I can still look at the camera and be looking at you. But thanks for sharing that, because this really is a great place to come and learn, and it's just not me, it's all of you. I've told you before, I learn from beginner gardeners all the time. Questions, just the questions that are often asked. I mentioned this in an older video I have about teaching kids gardening. I thought I knew a lot about gardening when I was running the school garden at Galileo, and I did. I knew a lot more about gardening than the average person. But when you're asked a question that you never even thought about, it really forces you to dig up some of that gardening knowledge and maybe even realize you don't have a clue and you need to learn more. And that happens to me all the time with some questions that are asked, where it's like, oh, I've got no clue. Now I got to go do some research and figure it out. So if I'm ever asked that question again, I'll know the answer. And that's one reason why I know as much as I do. It's because I've been asked thousands of questions over the years. And I did not know the answers to most of those questions when they were first asked. But I found the answer so that if that question is asked again, I either have an inkling of what the answer is, or I might just flat out know the answer, or that question generated interest enough in me that I went out and did it in my garden for myself to learn whatever the question was asking, and then I can speak from experience. So I learn all the time, and my learning is boosted by the questions that a lot of you are asking. So I appreciate it as well. I appreciate all of these Mondays that we can spend together. Okay, always nice to see new people checking in and all the comments going back and forth daily. Yeah, Cal's Cal 1699 saying remember to check the bag daily and get smelly fast. Yeah, if you do your tomatoes on the counter near a banana or an apple, you can see it ripening, and it does happen faster than if the tomato's by itself. But if you put it in a bag with something producing that ethylene gas, it can happen fast, and you do need to check it on a regular basis. That's a good point, because tomatoes can actually get overripe and nice and squishy if you put them in a bag and aren't checking them on a regular basis. Lars saying, first Master Gardener video meeting is this Thursday. Awesome. Soon we will have in-person meetings. So Lars going through a Master Gardener course, which I think is incredible. That's always a great thing. Master Gardener course is not going to teach you to be a perfect gardener, but it's a great exposure to a lot of gardening ideas and some good basic scientific approaches to gardening. So I'm glad for you, Lar. I think you're going to have a wonderful time in your Master Gardener program. And so I talked earlier about joining a gardening club to get to know other gardeners and to share gardening stories. Master Gardener programs in the United States and Canada are another great opportunity to get to know other gardeners, and usually gardeners at your level. So whether you've been gardening for years or are a new gardener, if you consider yourself a novice or an intermediate gardener, then seek out your Master Gardener program. Most states and provinces have some type of Master Gardener program that they'll teach usually once a year. These days it often starts in virtual training and then goes to in-person training. But it's a great way to meet other gardeners. Some of my all of my best friends who are gardeners I met through the Master Gardener program, because you just get to know them and then you just get to know them better. And now you start sharing the seeds and everything else, and sharing the stories and sharing the produce and getting together to talk gardening, and then throw your spouses off into another room for them to talk. And it's a great way to really socialize and build your gardening network. So good for you, Lara, and I hope some of the rest of you look into becoming a Master Gardener. You don't have to do anything with it. You know, I'm a Master Gardener who likes to teach gardening, and that was what I did in the Master Gardening program, because there would be dozens. I think at one point there were 150 or 160 active Master Gardeners in my program, but they couldn't find anyone to teach classes. And so as soon as I said, sure, I'll teach, they grabbed me and I started teaching classes on a regular basis. So don't think that you have to be like me teaching classes if you go through a Master Gardener program. No, it's just a great way to learn more about gardening and to become an opportunity to socialize with other gardeners as well. So don't let that hold you back. There's a lot of people that I went through the program with, or that I saw when I was teaching classes, that I've never seen since, because they got the information they needed and they moved on and they're doing their gardening, and that's okay. That's fine. So use it how you choose to, but it is a nice option and something to check into. Okay, let's see. Dowell's Homestead says, when you check soil pH with a meter, is it best done with moist or dry soil? So it depends on how you're checking it. So if you're checking it with a meter, like a probe that you stick into the soil, check the directions for sure, but most of the probes I've used, it does work better with a moist soil, not necessarily wet, just normal moistness of the soil. If you're doing a pH test, or you're taking some soil and you're mixing it with water to use either a strip or some chemicals, then it doesn't matter at all, because you're going to be adding some water to be doing that test. But check the directions for sure, because generally the probe should tell you the best conditions, and temperature might also make a bit of a difference as to when you check your pH. If you're doing a home test of your pH, do it in different areas and at different times of the day, and with the making sure that the soil moisture matches what it's supposed to be, because don't be surprised if you don't get some different readings depending on where you're doing it. And then it's usually recommended you take a number of different readings, and then you average those readings to determine what the pH happens to be in your soil. And so like I said, I've done it with moist soil before and gotten fairly accurate pH readings. The best way to figure out your soil pH is to send a soil sample to a laboratory and have them test it, and they'll give you the best results. And for them, it's actually dry soil is what they recommend to send to a laboratory. And so it all depends who is doing the testing and what kind of equipment as to whether it's dry or moist soil. So, okay, let's go ahead and move on to a question I have for you today. And it's a question I try to ask myself usually this time of year, and I usually find the same answer, but I do ask myself this question. It's a question I encourage gardeners to ask themselves as well. Usually at the end of the season, for those of us that our gardens are starting to fade and we're moving into the autumn, or at the beginning of the season, I ask the question again in spring before I start doing all the work. And the question is it worth it? Is it worth doing all of this gardening? Doing all the work, all the planning, all the effort, all the worry, all this stuff of covering the plants and uncovering the plants and getting the cover crops and preparing the soil. Is it worth it? I can't answer for you, but you need to ask the question, because it may not be worth it. Now, for me, this year, I spent a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of effort building new beds so that I could grow more. And I got a greenhouse so that I can grow more and I can grow longer. And so in a video that I did a while back, where I talked about the tomato that can cost $1,000 or more depending on how you approach it. Yeah, my tomatoes this year cost a lot because of the infrastructure I had to build to grow those tomatoes. Was it worth it? Oh, man. Going out and eating a Sun Gold tomato right off the plant or a Sweet 100 tomato right off the plant, yeah, to me, it's worth it. And that cost is amortized over the years because those beds are built. Now I can grow in them. But I'll never really fully get the dollar value out of that construction. I've put a lot of money into my raised beds, preparing the soil. I grow a lot, but my season is too short. So I don't think I'll ever really get the dollar value back from my investment. But that's not why I do it. I don't do it as a dollar investment. So is it worth it from a dollar cost averaging perspective? Well, maybe not. But the reason I'm growing my plants is so that I can go out and see the first raspberry of the year and eat it and just close my eyes and stand in the sun and know, yeah, it's worth growing raspberries. Even if I don't get another raspberry, that one raspberry made it worth it to me to grow raspberries this year. I got a ton of tomatoes, a ton of zucchini, a ton of eggplant. The cucumbers didn't do well this year. And for some reason, and this is one of those weird things about gardening, there is no explanation to figure out. I don't know anyone in my region that had a good cucumber year. At the garden club meeting, we're sharing our stories, and one of the women in the group said, I had a bad year. I tried growing cucumbers and I only had one cucumber. And then a couple other people said, yeah, me too. And I had the same thing. I had great hopes and plans for my cucumbers. I've only been harvesting a few. It hasn't been that good. Don't know why. Can try to figure it out. Could be the heat we've had, where we had the hot days and we lost the blossoms and they weren't pollinated. It could be the insects. Who knows? But we didn't get cucumbers like we expected. Was it worth it? Was it worth putting up the trellis and putting all those seeds in place and trying to grow the cucumbers for just a handful of cucumbers? Well, absolutely. Taking that fresh cucumber and mixing it with some of those fresh tomatoes and throwing in some fresh basil. Oh, yeah. Doesn't matter how much it cost. It was worth it to me. So ask yourself that question. What is it you are looking for from gardening? And that's why I say, actually ask yourself the question, is it worth it? Because if you're going into gardening with a particular perspective that you're going to save money in produce, well, you might not. And so if you do a cost analysis, you may realize, well, no, I'm spending more money on growing my plants than it would be if I just went to the store and bought that same fruit or vegetable. But if gardening is more than just the dollar value, what are you getting from it? And that's where the crux of this question really goes. What do you get from gardening? And if you can say, yes, it's worth it, all that sweat, all that labor, all that hard work, all those scraped knuckles and insect bites and everything else that happened, if you can still smile and enjoy that single raspberry or that cherry tomato that you pull off the plant, then the answer probably is yes, it is worth it. But it might not be. And I really, hate to see, but I do see it. Gardeners who try and just don't have the success, and they tell themselves that it's not worth it, and they stop. I'd much rather you do that. If you haven't had the success, if it's a struggle, then go ahead and take some time off. Go ahead and don't grow a garden next year. Go ahead and build your soil. Go ahead and learn more about gardening, and then take it up again when you're more ready, when you feel more confident, when you have some of that knowledge. The gardeners who tend to fade away and stop gardening are the ones who just keep working, not learning, not having that success. It becomes painful for them. It's not enjoyable. They stop gardening, and then they lose out on what I have in old age is a passion that gives me a reason to get up every day. That's one of those things that gardening can become. So do your own analysis. If it's not worth it right now, it's okay to stop, or it's okay to cut back, or it's okay to delay, because you can always pick it up later. And so if you make that determination that it's not worth it right now, it's like saying goodbye to a good friend knowing that you'll meet again. If you keep trying and it's that painful, emotional state, you give it up and you never see it again. And I'd rather you stop now, take a sabbatical from gardening, and then start up again. Or if you ask yourself that question, you say, yes, it is worth it. Now I say, okay, expand, do more, try new things. If this is the end of your growing season, figure out what you're going to add next year, because it is worth it. And the more you do, the more it is worth. That's the way I look at it. If this is your spring and you're moving forward and you're trying to figure out what your garden's going to look like, and you ask yourself that question, is it worth it? If the answer is yes, then add more, build more beds, do more things, pump more money into the garden if that's the approach you're taking, but it will definitely be worth it. So though those cherry tomatoes that I ate this year may have cost more than if I'd found them in the supermarket, well, the key is I wouldn't have found them in the supermarket. I would have looked, probably not found them, maybe found something that looked similar. When I did my trip and I went to San Diego and I ate at a nice restaurant and I ate an heirloom tomato salad that was on the menu, it was good. But I asked my server to ask the chef about where the tomatoes came from and what kind of tomatoes they were. They had no clue. They were just tomatoes they bought from some local distributor, from some local farm. They were good. They weren't as good as my tomatoes. So this fancy heirloom tomato salad that I had in a restaurant overlooking the bay in San Diego was not as good as the tomato salads I've been making myself with the tomatoes from my garden. So when I ask myself, is it worth it? Well, yeah, it's definitely way worth more than what I paid for in a restaurant, because I did it. I grew those plants, I harvested those tomatoes, and they taste so much better. So am I going to do it again? Well, of course I'm going to do it again. And next year, I'll be growing more tomatoes, and more peppers, and more eggplants, and more of everything else, because it's worth my time, it's worth my energy, it's worth my effort, and it's worth being able to sit here with you on a Monday and share our gardening stories and our successes and even our doubts and even some of our failures, which is all part of the gardening. So if you haven't already responded in the comments, let me know. Is it worth it to you? And it's okay if you say no. It's okay to say that you're taking a break, but my guess is most of you are going to say yes, absolutely. It's worth it. You want to keep doing it, and I say go for it. Keep doing it, keep having fun, and above all, enjoy gardening. I'm Gardener Scott. Let's see you here next Monday, same time, same place, and we'll talk more gardening. See you then.